motivation and training is a really important part of the work and is addressed in the government's FASD 10-year strategic plan. Video conferencing is just one way of, it's one of our initiatives on addressing education. We're so pleased with the ongoing interest and participation in this initiative. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing Kevin. Kevin Fisher is a registered psychologist and motivational interviewing network trainer, that's a mouthful, with private practices both in the city of Edmonton and Wetaskiwin. His past work as clinical supervisor and facility manager and senior instructor for the Alberta Alcohol Drug Abuse Commission, formerly known as ADAC, gives him direct experience working with individuals living with FASD. Kevin has served as an expert source on motivational interviewing and brain injury for hospitals throughout Alberta through the Northern Alberta Brain Injury Society, the Alberta Brain Injury Network, the Centennial Centre for Mental Health, and Brain Injury in Ponoka, and, of course, many others. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Fisher. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks very much. Welcome, everybody. For those of you in your remote sites, thanks for joining us. I do have a local site here, so I'm going to be talking with them a little bit, but please, as we go through, do those emails because I want to be able to answer the questions as we go along. First, how about we start off with, for those remote sites, if you can hear me okay, great. If you're having some troubles, maybe email those in too so I can make any adjustments. There's nothing more frustrating than coming to a course and not hearing anything. Let me give you a quick rundown snapshot of what we're going to be doing here in motivational interviewing. This is an hour and 45 minutes that's basically been condensed from a 40-hour course. So, Cole's notes would be saying it kind of lightly. And I want you to know right at the forefront one of the risks I have. As I have lots of information, I tend to speak more and more quickly. Somewhere between an auctioneer and somebody in a manic episode on crack. It's really bad. So I'm actually inviting the local folks here that if I start talking really fast and you can't understand me, wave your arms, do something like that, and then we can move on from there. So I hope everybody has the handouts because I'm going to be using that to keep me on track. And as we go along, again, if you have questions, I'm going to stop at regular intervals, and then at the end we'll make sure, or I'll try to make sure I have some time to answer any of those questions. So I understand that most everyone who's here for this presentation has interaction in some type with folks with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I am going to be teaching quickly on motivational interviewings, and then I will talk about some of the adjustments that from the literature and that I've noticed personally that help you to make MI work better with those clients. Let me tell you a little bit where the research is at. I talk about it at the end. Most of the MI research that's out there that has to do with FASD is specifically around prevention with pregnant or women who are in the childbearing age areas. So a lot of the stuff has been done around prevention, and you can modify or use MI in the prevention side. I'm going to be talking more specifically about working with specific individuals who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which I will from now on call FASD. Now, are people seeing the slides, or I don't know. We're on the first slide right now. How about we move to session goals, just so you know what I'm going to be touching on in the next hour or so. And we'll talk about familiarity. What is MI? We'll talk about ambivalence, what it is, because it's pretty key for motivational interviewing. Some traps. I'll talk about those when I go. I don't want to teach it all right now. We'll be talking about the spirit or some of the underlying philosophy of MI before we actually go into some of the practice or introduce those things to you, and to specifically evoke change, because that's what we're aiming for, is always in MI you're looking for movement from something to something else. So you always need to have a goal in mind when you're doing MI. So, and the goal is usually fairly specific. We're not trying to change individuals, we're trying to change a behavior or a series of behaviors inside them. And that's where you use the tools in order to do. And one of the things that happens as you do that is clients, individuals that you're working with can become resistant, where they don't want to do the changes. One of the really interesting things I'm going to touch on later, all this stuff I'm going to touch on later, is that resistance comes from two places, really. The most normal place it comes from is individuals are reluctant to make changes because changes can be scary for all of us. But the other place that it comes from is from the practices or behaviors of the interviewer, the professional working with that person. And so we're going to be talking about specific adjustments that you can make to your style that helps reduce some of that resistance and move through it. Then we'll be talking about the 4 basic counseling techniques, and finally some of those modifications. So I guess we're moving on to the second page here now, top slide. And it's a quote. And it just sort of sets up the idea of MI. And this is a quote from the most recent MI textbook from Miller and Rolnick. And I'll just read it. It says, "The word interview itself does not imply who has more power or is more important. One image that we use is of 2 people sitting side by side, paging through a family album of pictures, one telling stories, the other listening with friendly and personal interest. The storyteller turns the pages, the listener wants to learn and understand, and occasionally asks politely about a particular picture or ask a detail not mentioned." That's sort of a word picture of how this goes on. And it really has to do with the idea of 2 expertises that are sitting with MI. You as the professional, and I'm going to make some assumptions, but I think they're good ones, have some expertise around the change that's needing to be made. Could somebody get me some water? Just if I was going to grab that and I forgot. I'm getting dry here, but one is you have some expertise for the information that they need to know that's going to help facilitate the change. But the other expert is the person sitting across from me who knows about the details and the potential impacts of their life. And it's bringing those 2 things together in a smooth way that helps this thing work clinically. Thanks very much. So let's talk about the theory before we get into the practices. So, and do I do this later? Not so much. I'm doing the thing I'm not supposed to, shuffling pages in front of the mic. Pardon me to those 32 remote sites. Send in an email if I'm breaking your eardrums. I'll talk first about why it is that we do motivational interviewing in terms of research. There really are a couple of really well-researched approaches out there. Cognitive behavioral therapies being one of the most recognized in terms of high amounts of empirical literature to support its interventions. The second most research approach is actually motivational interviewing. And there is just reams and reams and reams of rather specific kinds of work. So as I answer your questions and point out some of this, I just need you to know that this is really well supported, and some changes are happening even now in the 3rd edition of motivational interviewing that's coming up. I have the privilege of sitting with Miller and Rolnick and Teresa Moyers, the 3 main writers of this, on a yearly basis. I'll be every October. I get to meet with them, and we get to talk about some of the underlying research stuff. So I can touch on that. So let's go into the theory stuff, the things that we know and that motivational interviewing assumes. And let me make this point first. Motivation interviewing is not the only or the best way to do counseling. It's one of many approaches, and it works very well for certain individuals at certain times, and it works terribly for other individuals at other times. So I think of motivational interviewing as like a tool belt or a tool. It's something that you use some of the times, and other times you don't. So when I'm doing my clinical practice as a psychologist, there are times when I'm using motivational interviewing, and there are times when I'm specifically not, and that's okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about when it makes sense. So one of the places where it makes sense, bottom of the second page, first bullet there, is when clients are ambivalent. They feel 2 ways about something. It's both a good idea and a bad idea. Does anybody here go to the gym? Does anybody here working on their diet? How about that one? Those nagging 15 pounds? Whatever it is, I like to use the gym one because this year's been a little bit better, but last year I spent $400 odd, and they got the workout clothes and the membership 2 times. $225 a visit. That was the most expensive workout place I have ever been to, and it wasn't even that good. And the interesting thing is when I was putting out that money, when I was buying the fancy workout clothes and the new shoes, I had every intention of going to the gym and working out. I had good reasons for it, physical health and things like that. But when I wasn't going to the gym, I had really good reasons for that as well. And if anybody had asked me, is it a good idea to go to the gym? Oh, absolutely. I have a gym membership. That's how important I think it is. And it's those kinds of competing interests that can either get us to do something that's healthy or prevent us. And we all struggle with those ambivalent kinds of things. So first we know that this ambivalence, or feeling 2 ways about something, is natural. The second thing that's really important from an MI perspective is the biological reality, the neurological reality, that as I pressure you to change, as I argue in favor of you making changes, I can almost guarantee that you will argue back status quo. It's this natural balance, counterbalance. People work against those things. And I see so many well-meaning counselors, myself included, that so passionately believe in something that make all the arguments and set up somebody to go the other way. Because the whole session they're saying, yeah, but. And the words that come out of their mouth are all the words about the status quo. So when we're talking about motivational interviewing, we're going to be talking a little bit about how to get them to do change talk. When they're resistant, they probably won't change. And when clients speak about change, it increases empirically the likelihood that they'll do that thing. So the amount that they talk about something it's almost linear in terms of the likelihood that they're going to do it. So top of the 3rd page, see how I'm doing for time here. Most people are not resistant to change. They're just resistant to being changed. And so we're working at change versus changing someone. Show of hands here. You can put up your hands at the 32 sites too. It won't matter. I won't be able to see it. Stages of change. Have folks heard about that? That one's also been around for a while. I want you to know that motivational interviewing is not dependent upon the stages of change, but it can be a good form of information. And I'll touch on the 6 stages a little bit and how to use motivational interviewing. So first one is pre-contemplation. Pre-contemplation is that state where people don't want to change. They like where they're at. And you can use the model of change is about a change process where you work from something into something else. So you move, and the change can be positive or it can be negative. So I'll give a personal example. I'll be sharing some personal stories as we go through here, time permitting, just to give a face to some of this. When I was in, my goodness, grade 7, so I was 12, same age as my oldest daughter. She may never see this tape. My very bad friend, Gordon, we went in. It's an interesting story because we went down to his parents' basement, and they had one of those deep freeze, and we opened it up, and the whole deep freeze was filled with cartons of cigarettes, which I think is odd looking back, but at the time I went, woohoo. So we got some of these cigarettes, and we went behind his house, and we had a tree house that was back there. And we climbed up into the tree house, and because we're 12-year-old boys, you don't go in the tree house, you always stand on the roof of the tree house and there. And we picked out the cigarettes, and we proceeded to learn to be smokers. For any of you here who are or have been smokers, so we put the cigarette up, my 12-year-old virgin lungs, light up and take a big, deep, because, that's what you see in the movies. Got completely dizzy, fell off the roof of the treehouse onto the ground, knocked the air out of my lungs. So I had tobacco smoke in there, and I knocked the breath out of me. And I proceeded to climb back into the treehouse to finish that cigarette. Because in the change process, I was very much interested in becoming a smoker at that point. Sometime later, I quit smoking, and then there was that whole process for anybody who's ever done that. The process of that is not so easy. But the act of doing it, and at that point I was pre-contemplative in the sense that I wasn't thinking about not smoking, and so I would overcome great bounds and boundaries in order to practice smoking. So when you're pre-contemplative, you don't care about the other side, and your job right there is to raise doubt, and that's basically bringing somebody into ambivalence, where there's two possibilities in front of them as opposed to just one. Contemplation, where the vast majority of people are at, is the belief that two things are possible, but you're not certain which one you want to do, or which one you're committed to doing. Might be a better statement. If you're in preparation, which is the third stage, is I've now made a decision that I need to change. Up until this point, I actually haven't done anything in order to make a change. So if I'm a smoker, for instance, I'm smoking when I'm pre-contemplative, I'm smoking when I'm contemplative, I'm still smoking when I'm in preparation. But now I have a plan to become a non-smoker. Interestingly, sometimes our use changes a little bit at that time. For pre-contemplative smokers, sometimes their smoking increases just before they decide to quit. Get one last good go at it before they change. Finally, there's the action where you're doing things that you need to do in order to make change. Interestingly, from the research, and I'll say this to all you folks, when people, there's certain types of clients that professionals tend to not to like to work with. And guess what? You guys have one of them. Profound neurological problems like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and addictions are two things that professionals tend to avoid like the plague. And one of the reasons is that it can be, I don't want to say difficult, but different in moving them through that change process. And just that educational process doesn't seem to work quite as well. Because the vast majority of programs assume that people are in action, and if they just knew the right things to do, then they would do it. And the vast majority of people are not in the action stage. They're in the contemplative stage. They're thinking about making changes. And so first stage, or the primary work in MI, has to do with people who are unsure about making changes or are equally comfortable doing either thing. After people change, they go into maintenance until they experience a lifestyle change. This says relapse. People fall back into old behavior patterns. But I don't recall if it's listed. It is listed on here. There is a termination where sometimes the change process stops. I'm an ex-smoker. I just bumped the mic. I'm an ex-smoker, and I don't currently have cravings or anything for cigarettes. So I've terminated that process. I'm not going through things around that. But that's not always the case. So slide middle of page 5 shows that the majority of people we're working with are contemplative. They're thinking about making changes, but they don't know exactly what to do with that, or they haven't done anything with that. At the bottom of page 5 is that there's this little triangle, and I want to touch on it when we're talking about motivational interviewing, and I'm going to get into the process of motivational interviewing. Mostly what people want to learn is how to do MI. We call that the practices. But like that triangle that's on the sheet, if you just learn the practices, it's like sitting a triangle at its pointy part, always falls over. You cannot do MI just utilizing the practices or the techniques. There has to be an agreement with the spirit and the principles of MI in order to do those practices effectively. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time right now talking about what the spirit and principles are before we get into how to do MI. So, spirit stuff, there's 3 qualities. It's autonomous, which basically means that the person who you're interviewing is the person who gets to decide. It's their life, and they can do what they want with that. And my job is to respect that. However, and this is an important however, pure client-centered therapy would say that person can do whatever they want, and my job is just to help them, let them explore whatever they want. From an MI perspective, it's a collaborative, that's the second thing to see, it's a collaborative approach because I have a goal in mind. So for instance, if I'm working with a client who has FASD and they're using alcohol at the same time, I know that's a problem. That's going to compromise other things that they might do. So my goal for them at the outset is get them to be non-drinkers. But I know from an MI perspective that if I spend my time telling them that they shouldn't drink and all the bad things that are going to happen if they continue to drink, and don't they know because of the science that it's a bad idea, then I'm likely increasing the likelihood of them drinking. So my job is a third part in that spirit, is to evoke for them or draw out from them the reasons that they need to make change. People pay attention to the things that they say. They don't pay attention to the things that other people say. And I know I'm saying that as I'm being a talking head here. This is an educational thing. When I do the full week session, we do lots of role playing. Can't do that in this hour and 45 minutes. I'm sorry about that, but I'll throw that out there as a teaser. Principles. Again, belief systems behind MI. First one is empathy. I have to believe in and like my client. I don't have to like what they're doing, but I need to have some care and concern for them, because people can tell when you're showing fake concern, and it doesn't help to be helpful then. You should know that you can't teach people empathy. But you should also know the fact that you're all sitting here and you work with the type of clientele you do probably means that you all have it in bucket loads. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time around empathy. Rolling with resistance. When a client throws up a barrier and says, I don't know that I want to do that, you respect that and you let it go. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. Develop discrepancy is the next one. That's an ambivalence, is that there's two choices and they could make either choice. And the roots of the study behind that is that cognitive dissonance, is if there's a big difference between what I believe and what I'm doing, or my two beliefs, that sense of discomfort I need to resolve. And I can do that really in one of two ways. I can change my behavior to correspond with my value system, or I can change my value system to correspond with my actions. So basically my job is to make it uncomfortable for you, or you make it uncomfortable for you, such that there is a desire to make some changes. And then the final one is support self-efficacy, which we also call change talk. Any change that can move forward. Practices that we're gonna go do future is the OR skills, which we'll touch on later. Using rulers to make change, that's one of the skill sets, and how to elicit change talk in an hour and 20 minutes, or about an hour, so we can have questions. So middle of page 6. Am I talking too fast yet? I will take a pause here. So motivational interviewing, inside of the spirit, it's that it's autonomous, the person gets to decide, versus authoritative, me putting it inside them. The next one, it's collaborative versus persuasive. Collaborative means I work with them to explore an argument versus give them the reasons and arm twist them into it. They've got that, the donkey, the stick or the carrot kind of thing. If I'm using either a carrot or a stick, I'm being persuasive. And the reality is either then or sometimes later that resistance is going to come up and they're going to throw away the carrot. We're really happy that they're away from the stick. And finally, it's evocative. The arguments for change have to come out of the person versus instilling those arguments in them. And so you have to be listening for change talk, and we'll talk a little bit about how you do that. Let's go into the principles now. So we're down at the bottom of page 7. Moving quickly now. So first is expressing empathy, and you do that primarily through the use of reflective listening. So responding back and treating as important the things that people say. And it's a very... I'm going to be talking about reflective listening in some detail later, so I'm not going to talk about it too much right now. But it's quite the skill to listen honestly and reflect openly. And I'm still learning it after almost 20 years of doing motivational interviewing. That's a long time. So that's foundational. Along with empathy is there is a difference. I'm accepting the person and not necessarily accepting their action. This is the top of page 8. And so I don't have to agree with what somebody's doing in order to express empathy and acceptance for who they are. My example for this one in my work with in fetal alcohol is a mother who is drinking heavily despite, say, already having children who have been alcohol affected, or knowing very well. And so you're sitting there, it can be difficult not to be judgmental in the process of that, to try to shame them into making changes, which I know doesn't work, but still kind of rises up inside of me, especially when I had young children. And so I have to put that aside and accept the person even as I'm looking to change their behavior. The middle is my attitude has to express that desire to engage and connect. And if it doesn't, then I'll produce resistance and a boundary. Which leads us to the developed discrepancy. What normally happens in poor counseling is there becomes a discrepancy or a difference between what the client wants and what the counselor wants. And then therapy becomes these sessions of arguing the 2 points until somebody wins. Truth be known, the client always wins because you can't make them change, even if you have them in some kind of closed settings. They can resist in all sorts of creative ways. I noticed that with my children are older now, but when they're little and you pick them up and they do that back thing, you try to pick them up, but it's like, it's hard to carry this 1.5-year-old because they're flailing, and if they don't want you to do something, you know it, and it's much better when they engage with you. And so when I'm looking for discrepancy, I'm looking at this difference, this ambivalence existing inside the person, and then helping them identify that. If somebody notices this discrepancy, that I believe 2 things, that what I'm doing is in conflict with my values or what I want, then that becomes uncomfortable. And one of the things that happens when we get uncomfortable is we defend it, or we resist it, or we throw up boundaries around it, and we say, no, that can't be true. I want to go back to the way that I was. And if someone does this, and this we know very well, and this is again one of the cores in motivational interviewing, one of the dangers amongst staff people, professionals, is they jump right on that bandwagon and they start trying to pull and argue them back to the place that they were. Because you were there, you had it. Come back with me. When somebody does that, you just need to roll with it. Rolling with it means just going with them. It's kind of like judo. If their energy is going in a particular direction, you just deflect it and let it go in that direction. As a matter of fact, one of the clinical tools that I use in motivational interviewing for people who are ambivalent and have done that is let them argue for the status quo. So they're arguing all the reasons why they should continue to do whatever it is that you don't want them to do. And they'll produce their own resistance, or what we call yeah, but statements. They'll get to a certain point and they'll say, all these things that I've said is true, but there's also another side. And they need to say it. And then you say something profound like, why don't you tell me a little bit more about that? And then the change talk is coming from their own mouth. And resistance is a natural and normal and healthy thing to have. So I don't treat it as a negative thing. It's just the normal process of change. And the final one on there is self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is all those qualities that people have that increase their confidence, their belief in and their ability to garner whatever change it is. So, and I'll talk about actually I'll talk about it, no, I'll introduce it now and then I'll talk about it again later. People can not believe in their ability to make changes. Let's use FASD as the example. We're into a conversation and somebody throws out the fact that they have neurological, behavioral, developmental problems, and that makes change impossible for them. What they're saying, or their resistance, is, I don't have the ability. And then you need to explore things that can improve their perception of their ability. Other things that can throw blocks into efficacy could be, oh, I could do that if I want, and that would be simple for me, but now's the wrong time. Talk to any teenager. Oh, I could go to school, and I could get A's, and I could, be a doctor, lawyer, movie star, rap star, but right now I just don't want to do all that. I'm going to go party with my friends. It's not that I couldn't. It's not that it's not important. It's just I don't want to do it right now. So it's not important to me right now. So we've done all this, and we haven't even talked about what motivation is yet. So top of page 10 is that this is the definition according to motivational interviewing. So it's the likelihood, and the likelihood is expressed as a probability that somebody could engage in a particular behavior at a particular time. So it's we're always motivated to do something, even if it's nothing. I could be highly motivated to not make any changes at all, but it's still a motivation. It's an internal thing because it's my thing, and motivation is fluid. It can change radically and drastically, even in moments. Here's my next workout analogy. So I had my card, and I went into my gym, and I used to race bicycles. So I used to be in really good shape. Used to is the key word in that. And so I'm saying, I'm a healthy guy, and I've done this. And so I get on the treadmill. Has anybody here been on a treadmill? The thing is evil. So it's got all these buttons on it, right? And so I'm in there, and I'm in my new workout clothes and my shoes, and I'm going to start. So I start to run, right? And I was like, this feels good. I'm finally here working out. I'm highly motivated to make changes, get healthy, lose a little bit. Who's run before? So you're running. And then I have this cramp because I haven't run in some time. So I've got this cramp, and I'm getting a little bit out of breath. And so I'm saying I've got it set for to run for 45 minutes. So I'm looking down. I've been running for 17 seconds, and I have a cramp, and I'm starting to get out of breath. And I'm looking around. There's all these healthy people in spandex who are running really fast and stuff. And I'm going, well, this isn't really good. Maybe I'll slow it down a little bit. And so you're slowing it down, and then but I push a button, and the ramp starts to go up. So now I have a cramp in my leg. I'm running out of breath. This machine's moving up on me, and I'm looking around, and suddenly my motivation has changed. I'm saying, if I keep running on this thing, I could die. Is it possible to have a heart attack at this age? And I'm looking around. I'm going to be humiliated. I need to get off this machine quickly and make it look smooth, like I forgot something important in the locker or something. And my motivation has changed. So I'm turning the time down. So I say, what kind of idiot set this to run for 45? Oh, it's me, right? And I'm moving it down, and my motivation is radically changing. And as I'm leaving the gym after doing that, I'm saying, as opposed to being confident and happy that I'm there, I'm going like, I'm out of shape. I don't know that I can do this. What's the point? I spent all this money. But I'll make sure I tell my wife that I ran for an hour. Because you can still lie. So I'm not saying that working out was a bad thing. I'm just saying my motivation changed radically in a short period of time as I engaged in the action of doing the thing that I thought was important. And that happens a lot of time with the people we work with. It sounds like a great idea until you start doing it. If anybody's done home renovations, it could be sort of another example. I think it's a great idea until you start. And your basement's flooded, or you end up in emergency with burnt legs. I have tons of stories. I'm not going to tell that one right now. So what is motivational interviewing? So the only unmotivated person is a dead one. And so everybody's motivated about different things. And so how do we apply motivation to the theory of motivational interviewing? And it's here at the bottom of page 10. So motivational interviewing as a definition is a client-centered directive, well, those two things, for enhancing the internal or intrinsic motivation for change by exploring and resolving their ambivalence or their uncertainties. So motivational interviewing, I'll just talk about the ambivalence there for a second. Motivational interviewing works very well when people are ambivalent, uncertain, or they're in the early stages of change. Just so that you know, if somebody is highly committed towards making a change, they've explored it in their mind and they start the process, and I do motivational interviewing with them, I can actually drag them back in the process. I can create ambivalence again. So there can be bad times to do motivational interviewing. I will never say in any of my presentations that motivational interviewing is the only or necessarily the best way of doing something. It's one way, or it's a tool in your toolbox, so to speak. So let's go back to the assumptions, top of page 11. How many pages do I have here? I think I have way too many pages. So it's optimistic. It's got a humanistic perspective, and it believes that people can make change. And it even believes that people can make change for those people that lots of people say change is impossible. And those are just the kinds of people that you work with. I spent 8 years working with adolescents, some of whom had cognitive damage because of their own behavior or their parents' behavior. And you wouldn't imagine the number of people who say, how could you ever work with them? Change in them is impossible. Whereas change for them is very normal. It's just sometimes difficult. You work with a group where change is difficult, but not impossible. And people sometimes project their belief systems that you can't change because of what's happened to you, and that could actually increase the likelihood of no change happening. So you need to be optimistic or believe that change can happen. It needs to be realistic, but it still needs to be there. Motivation is a state, not a trait, so it varies. And one of your jobs is to help increase motivation towards the action that you think is important for them. And you're working on that thing specifically. And ambivalence is normal, you can expect it. And resistance is normal, and you can expect it. And finally, motivation, or the existence or the state of motivation in someone, is an interpersonal process. So what I do with them when I'm interviewing them influences that. So 3 goals. Here's the 3 things you're trying to do with motivation interviewing. First one is you want to get the client to express their concerns about the current behavior and begin to make the arguments of why they need to change. This is why it's a problem. This is why I need to change it. The key part is they need to make it and not you. So I talked about this already in terms of types of motivation. Readiness is now a good time. No, it's actually willingness. Is this an important thing to do? And finally, ability. Do I have the core requisite or the skills in order to do this? And if somebody believes they have the ability but they're not ready to do it, and I'm looking for motivation to improve their ability sense, I'm walking down the wrong pathway because they already believe that. You'll get lots of that. I'll use my adolescent example. I'll get a teenager passionately arguing how they could quit tomorrow. That would be the easiest thing. This is what I would do. And you go, great. That's fantastic. Now go do those things. And they say, I don't want to. And you're saying, but we just spent a whole session talking about how you could change. They say, yeah. And when I want to, I will. Right now, I want to go smoke pot with my friends because that's a lot of fun. I'll see you tomorrow. Because they're waiting outside with me right now with pot. And I say, yeah. Wasn't this a good session? And I don't have enough time to tell more stories, so I won't. So readiness, willingness, and ability. And I'm moving them through that maze of ambivalence. Second thing, to get them to change talk, where they're talking about how and why and when they're going to make change. And so change talk, top of page 12, it's a generic term, and it basically encompasses anything that relates to their desire, ability, reason, or need for making a change. That's sort of the first set of change talk. I want to, I will, I can, I have in some ways. To commitment and the taking steps is now I'm going to do that. So people can spend a lot of time arguing about why they need to make a change before they start arguing about how they're going to make that change. And because the majority of people are in contemplation, you'll spend most of your time exploring why they should make a change versus how they should make the change. I'm gonna skip forward. You can read in terms of readiness, willingness, and ability because I touched on that. Top of page 14, and then you can go back and look at that. So there are reasons for making changes, and we're interested in whose reasons they are, and I have a little sort of picture there on the top of page 14 in terms of their level of concern. A lot of times, somebody comes in, and you are very concerned about their problem, and they're not at all. I'm going to tell you an embarrassing story. A gentleman came in, an elderly gentleman. I was working with Tasquin, second floor of the provincial building. And he walked in, and I said, I'm ready to do some motivational interviewing with him. So one of the first things that you do when you come into, it's no longer ADAC, Alberta Health Services, Addiction and Mental Health. When you come, one of the first things they do is you get this assessment, and it asks about your use and stuff like that. And so I look at this assessment stuff, and this guy had a real drinking problem. And so I was asking open-ended questions like that, and he clearly had a problem with drinking, clearly. And so I'm doing these open-ended questions, and I'm working with him. And third session, I met with him 3 times, so this is like 2 weeks later. And I had explored with him in some detail about his alcohol and the things that we're doing to him and stuff. And so finally I say, because I'm concerned, he's drinking pretty heavily, and I say, John, what brings you here today? That, we've talked about your drinking, your concerns, and your ex-wife and her stuff and like that. I just want to know what you want next. And he says, I want an apartment. So, well, that's a strange, and your drinking is causing problems in you paying rent. And he says, no, he says, I have no problem paying rent. They're kicking me out of my apartment because they're turning it into condos, and I need an apartment. And I said, and you're drinking and stuff. He says, oh yeah, that's a problem. I'm going to work on that sometimes. But way more important to me right now is finding an apartment. Can you put me in one of your apartments? Third session, second week in. I said, you're looking for seniors housing. That's downstairs, across the hall. Let me take you there. And it had to do with my concern was real. He had a drinking problem. I made sure he had my card when he was ready to talk about that he could do that. But much more important to him at that point was having a warm place to live in the cold and blowy snows of January. And because I failed to pay attention to his concern, we wasted 3 sessions. So, middle of page 14. Oh, this is another story. So the purpose of motivational interviewing is to help people talk themselves into change by thinking through the positives and negatives. And to ultimately make commitment by taking action when they're ready, willing, and able. It's 12 o'clock, so I'm not going to tell this next story. Normally the picture I have on there is my daughter jumping off of or almost jumping off a... Let's go through, because we're on page 15 and I have lots of time. I don't have lots of time. Change talk effects. What people say about change influences the likelihood that it's going to occur. And whoever is arguing change believes in that change. So if I'm arguing in change, I'll believe it. The client will tend to resist. If they're arguing for change, they'll tend to believe it and tend to do it. And it is influenced by counseling style. So there's that desirability, reason, and need thing. It's important that the clients say those things, and it's important for you to reflect those. And we'll talk about reflective listening later. Whenever you hear anything that incorporates some change thought, you reflect it. And don't reflect it too vehemently. And we'll talk about some changes you make with that with FASD in a few moments. I'm going to touch on the dangerous assumptions, because a lot of what people don't do or do, there's a lot of things that you could stop doing that's going to be better to help you do motivational interviewing than to do. So here's some dangerous assumptions: that the person is ready to change. Somebody walks in my office and they're ready to make a change right now. That's often not true. The second one is this person ought to change, that it would be better for them if they changed, and often they don't share that assumption. So they don't necessarily want to change. That their health or something central, or the health of their developing baby is the most important thing to them. Not necessarily true. Lots of things that we assume that aren't there. If this person decides not to change, then this whole process of counseling has been useless, which is also not true. That model of change, people make tiny little baby steps over the course of time, and people can make profound changes that you don't see, that can happen internally, that can help them later. Now is the right time to change, not necessarily true. I'm the expert. You should listen to me because I know some things. They're the expert too. You should listen to them. To be tough is good, not true. And people are either motivated to change or not, which is also not necessarily true. They could be motivated by something else entirely. I'm going to skip the traps because of the time, and I'm going to introduce you to the 4 basic skills for motivational interviewing. The first being open-ended questioning. I'm just going to touch on these skills because most people have them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that most people use them. So the first one, open-ended questioning, it basically means any type of thing that you do that encourages the client to speak. And it really can be about anything. So what it's not is it's not something that has a yes or no answer. It's not something that's clearly biased towards your agenda and allows them to speak about what's important. And it's because who is talking is the one who's talking is the one who's listening, the one who's talking is the one who's processing, the one who's talking is the one doing the work. And it happened in a lot, especially when you're a brand new counselor, where you want to share all the new stuff that you know, and you're doing all the work. The other person, not so much. I'll give one more example of an open-ended process. It was a 17-year-old female client who I'd had whose mother had sent her away for treatment through that new children with PCHAD, children in addictive drugs. And she had just come back from this session. Her mom had dragged her in by her ear. And she sat down across from me, and we'd had a really good rapport to this point. And so I'm looking at her, and I said, so what brings you today? Nice open-ended question to get her talk, and she says, nothing. Silence. Okay, all right. I notice, trying to think, that your mother just brought you in. What's that about? She's a bitch. Making some progress. Fantastic. Turns her head away from me and starts looking over the couch in the back. It says, you just finished this program. Can you tell me a little bit about that? No. Fantastic. We're running with stuff. So I'm going, well, what do I do next? How do I keep this open-ended? And I said, is there anything you want to talk about? No. Do you want to go back out? And she says, I can't leave right now. I have to stay here for a while. All right. 45 minutes of silence. Nothing happens. So for me in my head, 8, 12 hours, it's just tick, tick, slowly. Every now and then I'm saying, anything? I say, do you want to, cut off this? Nope. 5 minutes to go before finally we can get out and her mom won't be suspicious. And she turns to me and she starts to talk about how people, her mother, those counselors, everybody's forcing her to do these things. How the problems weren't her drugs and stuff, and starts talking about abuse and she talks for an hour and 10 minutes from that point and just goes. I come out, it's like 2 hours after she brought him in. The mother's just thrilled. She says it must have been great work because she was in there for so long. And I was open-ended by not imposing my agenda. And she opened up with her stuff. And it was painful to not impose. But it was a form of open-ended, more of an open-ended attitude of when you're ready. So open-ended questions are sometimes things like, so, and see what they fill in. And they'll fill in all sorts of interesting things. So let's talk about open-ended questions and the work with folks with FASD, because there are some small changes. The first one is a so question to someone with FASD might be too open. You need to be a little bit more concrete with folks with FASD in order to help bring into context what it is you're talking about, because they're likely to miss some other context. Sometimes your questions are going to be very specific because they might lack some insight. Sometimes your questions are even forced choice kinds of things. Is it more like this or is it more like that? In order to provide to them, again, context about the thing that they're going to work with. And with FASD folks, as with very young adolescents, it's okay to sometimes ask closed-ended questions if it keeps the conversation moving back and forth. So some of those forced choice things are some subtle changes that you need to have. That said, at some point, information is going to come out of their mouth. And your job is to abandon the questioning at that point and start reflecting on the things they say, because whatever it is that they say is important to them at that moment, and it's important to explore. So you shouldn't ask a bunch of questions in a row, or we get into what's called a question and answer trap, which is all about your agenda and not about what's going on inside them. So you'll learn to, or if you can, ask questions without a question mark by reflecting or noting things and making statements that encourage more conversation. Or short little thing, why don't you tell me more about that? That's interesting, period. I have sentence strings like that on the back of my office, including ones with one client, just from the use of my eyebrows. They talk for a whole session without me saying anything, because we have all these nonverbals that can encourage conversation. So that is open-ended questions. We're at about 10 after 1. I'm going to go through this and then we'll open up questions at that point, I think, just because I know that's not the ideal way of doing this, but time is of the essence. So affirmations, anything that you can say positively about a person help increase the likelihood that change can happen for them in the future. So especially with folks who are often identified by their deficits, like some of the clients that you work, affirmations, statements about their positive qualities are key. They're so important. That's true with everyone, even more true with the clientele that you're working with. And they need to be based on something that's real, because if they're too airy, then that can cause resistance also. So affirmations can help build rapport. It's great for empathetic listening. It's a good way of highlighting exceptions to the rules by congratulating or reflecting or encouraging healthy choices or choices against the status quo, along with their strengths. With FASD clients, they need to be very specific and quite concrete. General statements, generally speaking, they aren't terribly good at transferring those skills into another setting. So next, reflective listening. I already mentioned that reflective listening is very important. One of the reasons it's important is because what people say is what they hear, is what they think about, is what they do. And so by reflecting positive change, by reflecting positive statements, by reflecting healthy choices, I increase the likelihood that people will do those things. And so people remember what they say, they don't remember what you say. Repeat back to them the healthy things that they say. I'm now really at the top of page 22. I'm zooming through this stuff. You should mostly do reflective listening. So if reflective listening should happen at least twice as often as open-ended questioning. And if you're asking lots of questions, that level of concern, who's in control, has just happened. Sometimes early on in an interview, you'll ask more questions, and then it should move mostly into reflective listening. With FASD clients, this is the bottom of page 23, if you see an insight or a healthy choice or something that's important to say, reflect it immediately. You can't reflect it sometimes later. They won't make the connection. Don't wait for them to make the connection. Don't wait for them to say something explicitly. As soon as something that suggests healthy choice, jump all over that, reflect it, and affirm it, because you need to draw those connections for them. Use short sentences. Repeat back what they say, specifically to highlight something, because if you're too, you need to be concrete. The other thing, sometimes people make the assumption that you just reflect back words, and you don't have to. You can reflect back actions, behaviors. If you hear that they're doing something, I heard that you did is a form of a reflection, even if you got it from someone else. Top of page 24, running through quickly summaries. So we've done reflective listening, we've done open-ended questionings. We've done affirmations, now we're doing summaries. Summaries are just a form of reflection. Summary is taking all the good stuff that they've said, bundling it up together, and then giving back to them. That's something that's called a collecting summary. So summaries, remember what people say is important. So you do a summary so that they hear positive change talk 3 times. They hear it once when they say it, they hear it once when you reflect it, and they hear it again when you summarize it for them. Those are the 3 components. Collecting summaries that bring it together and giving them back to kind of like a bouquet. Collect all this stuff together, here you go. Linking summary, this is really, really, really key for FASD clients. Linking summaries is ways from making a connection between one thing and another. Because sometimes with FASD, they lack the insight to make linear connections between one thing and another. This is you drawing the dot to dot for them. That when you did this skill, that works really well to do this thing that you've been trying. Let's talk about that. And you've gathered the things that they've done and you've placed it in a new place for them. And now you're going to let them explore doing that thing that they've said in a new place. That's a linking summary. You've drawn what they've said and you've placed it in a new setting. Finally, transitional summaries. Top of page 26. Transitional summaries are ways of tying something up. So if somebody's talking endlessly about one topic matter, and I know that can happen, and not just with FASD clients, it's a way of drawing all those things together, putting a neat little bow on it by saying back to them what they're saying, and then moving on to another topic matter. And it's a way of saying, I've heard what you're talking about, and that's important. Let's talk about something different. This is a shifting process. So for reflections or summaries, with FASD clients, always note the important points of the session and restate them at the end so they can draw them together. Sometimes helps to write them out too, so they can be mindful of them. Talk about the connections. It's a form of a transitional summary. Is you've done all these things and you've done all these things, and those things meet together. That's what I was talking about in doing the dot to dot. So that's like reflecting back consequences, reflecting back how choices lead to certain outcomes, because they may not see that. And then you probably need to do some summarizing if you've had several sessions with them, at the beginning of the session talking about all the things that you've talked about in the past to bring them up to speed, because they're not necessarily going to come in with that same background just because of memory challenges. All of this is designed, which is the next point here, is to move people towards change talk. That as they work through this ambivalence, this feeling 2 ways about something, what you're listening for and what you want to reflect is anything, any argument, any statement that moves them towards change that you see as beneficial. So somebody could say 10 things about how drinking isn't a big deal for them, and they might say 1 thing about how drinking has caused a problem for them in the past. And I would reflect the change talk. It can cause a problem because they're going to explore that. Maybe I should reduce the amount that I drink. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about that? Because that could lead into the arguments about the kinds of effects that it has, and leads them into a place where I say, maybe I'll give it up altogether. And with motivational interviewing, I mentioned it briefly at one point, but it's about taking baby steps. It's very dangerous, actually, for people to leap from, I don't want to do anything, to I'll do everything about it. Because those are very unstable kinds of movements. You want them to make it a tiny little step-by-step journey towards that place. And then they're much more likely to stay there. So I get a little troubled if people join with me in the thing that I want. Absolutely, I'm going to quit altogether. That won't be a problem. Because it's probably not true. It probably has lots of denial into it. With change talk, you're working through all the things that they believe such that, or till they get to the place where they keep talking about change. And change is always contextual. This is the bottom of page 27, is that change talk always has to do with the purpose or the behavior target that I have. So whenever I'm doing a motivational interview with someone, I need to have in mind an end goal. Because in the absence of that, we can just talk in circles. And again, I'll say again, they're often tiny little steps in the direction that you want. So and I know I'm doing now again pregnant mothers. If my first consult interview has got them to reduce the amount of alcohol they consume because it might be a problem, that's a baby step. It's not ideal, it's not perfect, it's not where I want to stay, but it's a step in the right direction. If they're going to look at information to talk about some of the changes, if they're going to contact an organization that might help them with that, all of those are baby steps along the way, even though they're not there all together yet. Shuffle. Where am I? Page 27. I was at the bottom of page 27. Remember, the more that they talk about change, the more likely it is to occur. The more they talk about the status quo, the more likely that is to occur. So reflecting change talk helps them talk about change. So whenever I hear that, even a little bit, then I run with that. Understand that them talking about change can lead to that paradoxical thing where they talk about the status quo, and that's okay. That's them working out ambivalence. And how change tends to happen, when it happens well, is they talk about change, they're moving in the direction that you want them, they get nervous because they're talking about lots of change, they do the yeah but, they do the balance thing. Somebody has their mic off of mute, and they're shuffling. It's pretty loud. Maybe just people check.
Striped shirt. We can't tell what site you're at, but you're in a black and white striped shirt and your microphone's unmuted. Please mute your mic.
Thanks very much. So as you're moving in that direction and they're making the changes, they're going to talk about the yeah but stuff, but it's causing these problems. Let them do that. It works out their ambivalence, and then they'll talk about change. So it's kind of like the stock market in good times. It goes up and down, but it has a trend in the right direction. If you're doing it poorly, it has up and downs, but it has trends in a negative direction. Top page 28. We're good with time here. So change talk has to do with this darn cat. And I'll talk about the two categories of change for the darn cat. Is it?
Thelma, is that you? Thelma, it's Janice in Edmonton. Can you mute your mic? Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And I apologize if I'm being a paper wrestler too. It's one of the small challenges with doing it by this format. So there's two categories of change talk, and I'll talk about the differences with this darn cat acronym. So there is change talk for people who are ambivalent, and there is change talk for people who are in preparation and talking about making change. And I'll talk about the type of change talk to look for depending on who you have. So if I have somebody who's ambivalent, I don't know what I should do, and my reflections are all their talk about this is how I'm going to do it. If they're talking darn and I'm reflecting cat, I'm going to produce resistance and I'm going to decrease the likelihood that they have change. Because basically what I'm doing is I'm pushing them, I'm cajoling them into doing change action when they're talking about, I'm thinking about doing this, but I'm not sure. So if somebody's unsure, the type of change talk that you reflect is that unsure stuff, the change talk that explores deciding to make a change. And that helps move somebody into action so they can do stuff. So if somebody's ambivalent and I'm reflecting action, I create resistance and I shut the change process down. Conversely, if somebody's in the action stage and they want to make changes and they want to know how to do it, and I'm reflecting ambivalent language, this darn stuff, I actually pull them from the action stage back into ambivalence, and I affect their change process. And so I have to listen very closely as I'm reflecting. Are they mostly exploring whether or not to change, or are they mostly exploring how they're going to change? and then my reflections are going to be different depending on what those are. So let's talk about those two different types of language. So change talk that is ambivalent: desire, ability, reason, and need. This is something that I want to do. A want to is a desire. It's ambivalent, but this might be a good choice. Ability is I know that I would be able to, or I could do this if I needed to. That's another ambivalent language that is moving towards going into change. These are all the reasons of why I should change. I know that I should do this or would help in this way. And then finally, any factor that's in their life that's pressing them towards change, I need to do this. So for instance, I'm going to do the prevention stuff with the mother again. The mother might desire to drink, could drink, has lots of good reasons to drink, but knows she must stop drinking because of the impacts on development. And I'm not going to reflect all her desire, abilities, and reasons for drinking, because that's status quo. But I really might focus on all those. These are the reasons why I have to help move her into the place where she can change. If, on the other hand, she's saying, I need to do this, this is important, then you're in CAT language, which is really just CT language. There's commitment. I'm going to do this. I'm planning to do this. This is how I'm going to do this. And exploring change talk or planning talk that way is great. Facilitating help with that. If you want help doing that planning, here's some resources that we might be able to provide and those kinds of things. The I plan to and that I plan to and I have planned are kind of the same thing. So commitment and activation are kind of similar. Taking steps are a list of all the things they've done up to this point. This is all the steps I've taken already. So the more reflections that you can make over the things they've already done, the more likely they are to make the next small step. And that's a great way of summarizing stuff, listening for all the things that they've already done to move them to the next stage. And that's the baby step thing, because all their taking steps might be minuscule compared to what they need to do. But if you can still reflect those, that'll lead them to the next step in that process. Versus what I used to do is saying, I know you've done all that stuff, but that's not going to add up to a hill of beans based on what you need to do. You stupid fool. Why were you even trying that? You need to do this. Not helpful. I don't know that I was that bad, but I probably was. I just want to take this moment to apologize to those 10 years of clients that I experimented on. Because I'm sure I wounded some of them. I'm probably not ideal now either. So now let me talk about, so if somebody is ambivalent and they're working for, I'm going to talk about the types of change talk that you listen for. There's 4 categories of change talk, and this is all stuff that if you have categories you can listen for it. So the first one is that there's some negatives to the status quo. What I'm doing right now is causing problems. That's change talk. Recognize where I'm at isn't so good. You can't just reflect that, because the other side of it, the second one here, is that they need to feel that change is possible, or their optimism towards change, that change is something that is doable. Because there are some people who really realize that their choices now are bad, but have no belief or optimism about their ability to change. So they just, we call them, I was going to say what we call them, and it just escaped my brain. Demoralized contemplators. Is that I was thinking about doing this, but every time I've tried in the past I've failed, so why bother? I'm not capable of doing it. In which case, from the motivation side, I'm listening for confidence or ability. I'm able to do this, and I have those characteristic skills in order to do this. And I wouldn't reflect that this is an important thing to do, because they already believe that. That's not their issue. I know this is important, I just can't do it. And so then I'm listening very carefully for the kind of change talk I need. This happens a lot in my observations when people do work, is they're very good at reflecting change talk. They just reflect the wrong kind. And you need to reflect the kind that the person is stuck in to move forward. So that's the second kind, is optimism around change. The third kind is the intention. Is that I need to change because there's some negatives around here. I'm optimistic that I could, and intention is here's how I'm going to. Intention is the planning process. And people can do a lot of planning without actually doing anything, and that's all right, as long as you're working through them and you're starting to set timelines. The nice, I'm going to say that. The final one, the fourth one, I say that because I looked up, 22, okay. The fourth one, so we have recognition, optimism, intention, and the last one is that if I were to make changes, things would be good. There's some positives to that I can celebrate this change versus dread all those changes that are going to be there. And those are four sort of categories of change talk that you can reflect. I'm going to throw in some of the things that I've done working with FASD clients that I found to be helpful, and it's these last two slides here in terms of some modifications specifically with these clients. First one is motivational interviewing was initially designed as a cognitive approach and a verbal approach. It was a lot about talking and reflecting through language, which causes some actually rather high-level processing. One of the things that can be helpful if you're seeing a tendency towards something is to do role-playings. As opposed to talking about something, let's act it out. I'm going to play somebody, you're going to play something, and we're going to practice skills. Because you said this is what you're going to do. Let's pretend. You can do that in different ways. You can do that in sandbox. You can do that with a dramatic role play. You can do that by them describing how it would go in terms of narrative storytelling. Any of those things, as they're doing that, you can give reflections and affirmations, and you can walk through the process. And again, for FASD clients, actually this is true for any clients, you can see weaknesses in the connections between what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. So when you see giant holes in their plan, without saying you have giant holes in your plan, you can do reflections to help them make that more complete and play it out some more. Say, I noticed as we were playing that role play that you had some troubles here. What are some of the things that you could do about that problem? And let's explore. Why don't we try role-playing it and you add this skill that we learned about last week or in this course that you're doing, something like that. Why don't you try that? And how did that work for you? And then they've done something already. And once you've done something, it's easier to do something again, or at least remember it, versus what we all have to do, and is again troubling for some of those executive processing disorders, is now I've learned about this thing, I have to apply, I have to think about that it applies into this situation, now I have to utilize those skills at this moment. Yikes. Very advanced. Role-playing, excellent. Teach generalization, which is really a fancy way of saying simplify. When they make something complicated, make it simple. With people who have a singular problem or something that's creating a problem, I'll do an emergency escape plan or something like that. It says, if ever you get in a situation where you're not sure what you do and you think you're heading in the wrong direction, what should you do? And they should say, oh, I'll take out my emergency plan. Let's talk about that. So ways of escaping, ways of checking in with somebody who can be an aid to them, anything that's going to help to increase the likelihood in that situation. And if it's the same thing and if it's simple to complete, then it increases the likelihood they're going to follow through on it. One of the things in terms of generalizations that can help is I will do, especially with people who have high levels of executive dysfunction, I will do MI with their environment. So for instance, bring them in with their family or with their peer group or other people who are supporting them in their planning process. And so when they role play themselves into a certain situation, then sometimes you'll get, say, a friend saying, well, I can be there in these kinds of circumstances to support you. Is that okay? Asking the person that we're working with. And say, yeah, that would be fantastic. Okay, let's talk about that process together. And most people, I'll rephrase it, no people make changes on their own. No person is an island. So if you can bring in those support systems, then that would be great. It's also a good way of helping build confidence in support mechanisms, say parents who sometimes have guilt, especially mothers, around producing these conditions or contributing to these conditions. And if you can make them a part of the change process, then that can be empowering, which is a good thing. So So if families are involved, great. If families aren't involved, then hopefully there's support mechanisms. I'll bring in schools or talk to schools or other systems or structures that they have in place to make this a team effort. So that is generalization. Keep the focus on how can I help. So because you're working in some kind of professional capacity, always reflect back on what it is that you can add to or provide to their plan to make it simpler. If they're going to need an aid or a tool to make to the next step, I would imagine one of the main things that you folks do is serve as a go-between between systems and supports. Is that you're having trouble getting, I will help you do the process of garner that support. And if they ask for that support from you, then it's part of their plan as opposed to you imposing it upon them. Always focus on strengths. I'm going to make an analogy between FASD and brain injury because I see a lot of similarities with brain injury, especially traumatic, newly acquired brain injury. There is a tendency towards focusing on the losses. These are the things that I could do if I had, in a brain injury case, the things that I had, or in an FASD, if I hadn't been injured or damaged in this way. And it's basically ways of talking themselves out of change by using their deficits as the argument. So wherever you can see strengths, wherever you can do affirmations like that, and it's not like saying, oh, you don't have any problems, because that would be a lie. It's reflecting, on the one hand, you have these problems. On the other hand, you talked about some of these skills that you had, like, you want to talk about those a little bit more, and it's putting that you have both challenges and benefits. In-term goals, very small steps, baby steps. I talked about that already, and certainly the process of involving individuals in their environment to move forward. And if you can make things visual, that's always good. That is the work around this study that I researched around some of the specific changes around motivational interviewing and work with FASD. Now, I know that as we're saying that, there is just a humongous variety in the effects, the fetal effects. And so you're going to work with people with varying levels of ability. MI still works through that. The difference is really on the level of concreteness and the dots that you draw. That doesn't violate the spirit of MI because it is collaborative. Always through that, you have to remember that it's the individual that you're working with that has to make the choices. And wherever you can make them more confident in that choice making, that is going to be good.